Ambiguity is rampant in newspaper headlines. One of my favorite examples is Mrs. Gandhi stoned in rally in India. Yes, a newspaper actually printed that headline. It can mean either that the crowd threw stones at Mrs. Gandhi or that she took drugs that intoxicated her. You had to read the article to find out. Another favorite is Police kill man with axe. Here the issue is not that a single word like stoned changes meaning, but instead that the man might be with axe or the police might be with axe. When grammar or syntax creates ambiguity like this, it is called amphibole. Either kind of ambiguity can produce amusement, not only in headlines, but also in jokes, such as, I wondered why the frisbee was getting bigger, and then it hit me. Such ambiguity is not as innocuous when it ruins arguments. Imagine someone arguing, my neighbor had a friend for dinner. Anyone who has a friend for dinner is a cannibal. Cannibals should be punished. Therefore, my neighbor should be punished. This argument is fallacious, but why? Its first premise seems to mean that my neighbor invited a friend over to his house to eat dinner. In contrast, its second premise refers to people who eat friends for dinner. These premises, thus, use different meanings of the phrase, had a friend for dinner. And if the whole argument sticks with the same meaning in both premises, then one of the premises comes out clearly false. The first premise is not true, I hope, if it means that my neighbor ate a friend for dinner. The second premise is not true if it refers to people who have friends over to their houses for dinner. Thus, the argument fails on either interpretation. This fallacy is called equivocation. A more serious example is the widespread argument that homosexuality is unnatural, so it must be immoral. This argument clearly depends on the suppressed premise that what is unnatural is immoral. Adding that extra premise, the argument looks like this. 1. Homosexuality is unnatural. 2. Everything unnatural is immoral. Therefore, 3. Homosexuality is immoral. The force of this argument depends on the word unnatural. What does unnatural mean here? It might mean that homosexuals violate laws of nature, but that cannot be correct. Homosexuality is not a miracle, so premise 1 must be false in this sense of unnatural. Instead, premise 1 might mean that homosexuality is abnormal or an exception to generalities in nature. This premise is true, simply because homosexuality is statistically uncommon. But now is premise 2 true? What is immoral about being statistically uncommon? It is also uncommon to play the sitar or to remain celibate. But sitar playing and celibacy are not immoral. On a third interpretation, premise 1 might mean that homosexuality is artificial rather than a product of nature alone, as in food with all natural ingredients. But again, what is wrong with that? Some artificial ingredients taste good and are good for you. So premise 2 again comes out false on this interpretation. These critics of homosexuality might mean something more sophisticated, such as contrary to evolved purposes. This interpretation is more charitable and plausible. Their idea might be that it is dangerous to go against evolution, such as when someone tries to hammer a nail with his head, since our heads did not evolve to pound nails. This principle, plus the added premises that the evolved purpose of sex organs is to produce children, and that homosexuals use their sex organs for purposes other than to produce children, might seem to support the conclusion that homosexuality is dangerous or immoral. How can homosexuals and their allies respond to this argument? First, they can deny that the only evolutionary purpose of sex organs is to produce children. We also evolved in such a way that sex can bring pleasure and express love in heterosexuals as well as homosexuals. There is nothing unnatural about those other purposes. Sex can serve many evolutionary purposes. Second, defenders of homosexuality can deny that it is always dangerous or immoral to use bodily organs apart from their evolved purposes. Our ears did not evolve to hold jewelry, but that does not make it immoral to wear earrings. By the same token, the claim that homosexuals do not use their sex organs for their evolved purposes also would not show anything immoral about homosexuality. Finally, the argument might use unnatural to mean something like contrary to God's plan, intention, or design for nature. The main problem with this move is to show why defenders of homosexuality should accept premise 1, which now claims that homosexuality is contrary to God's plan or design. This premise assumes that God exists, that God has a relevant plan, and that homosexuality violates that plan. Many critics of homosexuality accept those assumptions, but their opponents do not. Thus, it is not clear how this argument is supposed to have any force against anyone who did not already agree with its conclusion. Overall, then, this argument that homosexuality is immoral because it is unnatural suffers from a central ambiguity. It commits the fallacy of equivocation. This criticism does not end the discussion. Defenders of the argument can still try to respond by delivering a different meaning of unnatural that makes its premises true and justified. Alternatively, opponents of homosexuality could shift to a different argument. But they need to do something. The burden is on them. They cannot rely on this simple argument in its present form if it equivocates. This example illustrates a pattern of questions that we should ask every time we suspect a fallacy of equivocation. First, ask which word seems to change meaning. Then ask which different meanings that word could have. Then specify one of those meanings at each point where that word occurs in the argument. Then ask whether the premises come out true and provide enough reason for the conclusion under that interpretation. If one of these interpretations yields a strong argument, that one meaning is enough for the argument to work. But if none of these interpretations yields a strong argument, then the argument commits the fallacy of equivocation, unless you simply failed to find the meaning that saves the argument. Slip sliding away. Now you know something about why we need arguments, what arguments are, how to analyze them, how to evaluate them, and how to catch fallacies. What next? First, admit your limits. This short book has barely scratched the surface. You have seen some purposes of arguments, some words in arguments, some valid forms of argument, some kinds of induction, and some fallacies. That is a lot to have covered, but please do not imagine that you know it all. Nobody does. Second, learn more. To understand arguments and reasons fully will take a lifetime. In addition to exploring further kinds of arguments, we all need to know more about language, our shared means of communication, science, including psychology and economics, mathematics, especially statistics and probability, and philosophy, which explores our basic assumptions and values. There is much more to study. Third, keep practicing. The only effective way to learn how to identify, analyze, evaluate, and avoid fallacies in arguments and reasons is to practice, and practice again. The best way to practice is with other people, and the best people to practice with are people who disagree with you but sincerely want to understand you and to be understood by you. If you can find such partners, you are lucky. Treasure them and use them. Fourth, construct your own arguments. When you want to think about an important issue, construct the best argument that you can on both sides of that issue. For example, if you want to decide whether to buy a larger car or a smaller car, spell out the reasons on both sides, such as greater comfort in a larger car and less environmental impact from a smaller car. And if you can vote in an election, specify the reasons for and against each candidate, such as more focus on issues that matter to you or less ability to get anything done. After laying out your reasons in discursive form, do a close analysis and a deep analysis of your own argument and evaluate its validity and strength. If you do this honestly, you will gain a better understanding of your beliefs, your values, and yourself. Then ask a friend, colleague, or opponent to analyze and evaluate your arguments and return the favor. This exchange will help you both understand each other better. Fifth, use your skills. When? Throughout your daily life, including internet chats, political debates, and other contexts where polarization and incivility run rampant. Don't simply declare what you believe. Give arguments. Don't let others merely announce their positions. Ask questions about their reasons. Don't interrupt. Listen carefully to their answers. Don't attack opponents too soon. Interpret them charitably. Don't insult or abuse opponents. Be civil and respectful. Don't commit fallacies. Be critical of your own reasoning. Don't think that you have all the answers. Be humble. Sixth, teach others. The skills that you have learned are not widely enough shared, so share them widely. One method involves explicit training or lengthy discussions about argumentation, but that is not the only way. You can also teach others simply by pointing out problems as they arise in informal contexts. When one person interrupts another, you can ask, "What were you saying before you were interrupted?" When someone calls an opponent crazy or stupid, you can say, "I don't think you are crazy. I want to understand your point of view." When a speaker presents a bad argument, you can specify precisely what is bad about it. When they present a good argument, you can say why it is good. We too often let teaching opportunities like these slip by. We cannot always follow these rules. It takes too long to practice or to construct and listen to arguments on every issue. Nobody has that much patience or time. Moreover, not every circumstance is right for teaching, and not every audience is amenable to learning. Even incivility is sometimes justified. Nonetheless, we could all benefit from following these rules more than we do now. So let's get started.